This is Beyond the Weekend, a podcast of Cornerstone Church, where we dig into the things we didn't have time for on Sunday. Welcome to BTW. Welcome to this week's episode of Beyond the Weekend. I'm Mandy Fowler, the Director of Spiritual Formation. Today, I'm being joined by Tracy Bowers, who's our Director of Outreach at Cornerstone. Welcome, Tracy.
Thanks, Mandy. I'm glad to be here.
So we are in the last week of this series, Worth the Risk. And this Sunday's message was all about how it's worth the risk to share Jesus with others. And we came at it from kind of an interesting angle. We shared a story from the Old Testament that's a little bit of a, I would say, probably not a common story that's told because it's in the midst of a terrible situation.
I would agree with that.
Yeah, not exactly Sunday school appropriate per se. And we kind of skipped over some of the worst stuff, but the part that's related to what we're talking about is these four lepers who, you know, there's a series of events. They stumble into the enemy camp and the enemies have fled and they're leaving all their food and treasures behind. And so the lepers have the opportunity to either just gorge it
hoard
it, take it and run. And we're talking about people who are ostracized from community, right? Yeah. So they are unclean. They're not welcome, you know, so they're on the fringes already. Right. So they would have been well sort of within their rights to just go.
Care for themselves because no one else is helping care for them. Mm-hmm.
And you even kind of imagine, but they choose to go back and tell the city that this is here for them. And you can even imagine, like, it doesn't go into this in the passage, but like, I mean, they would have probably had to like stand far away and call, like it couldn't come near, you know? So it's interesting when you think about the dynamics of that, but we related it to our faith and finding the treasure of Jesus. Right. And do we hoard that to ourselves or do we go and tell?
Right. Do we do that? Mm-hmm. I remember being at a conference one time and hearing, like, you talk about the things that you love. Mm. You talk about things that excite you. And
a new TV show, a book you just read.
Right. Yeah. All of these things. And then how often are we talking about a God who loves us and loves every human on the planet? Mm-hmm. And how often are we sharing that in a time when sometimes that can be hard? Mm-hmm. People are... What does it mean to be a follower of Jesus, or more specifically, the language of being a Christian right now? Mm-hmm. What does that really mean? Yeah. And people have there's some baggage that comes with that these days. So like how do you share the story of your own faith? Yeah. With your friends, your family, your coworkers, whoever God brings in your midst.
Right. Well, and they brought in a little more nuance into the message because it's not that we're supposed to like run around shouting this to strangers and whoever, you know.
Right.
Hey, evangelism, Jesus.
Street corner evangelism comes to mind.
Exactly. But we brought into the conversation 1 Peter 3:15-16, I think it is. Let me pull it up.
Sure.
Because I have a version of it memorized, but it's not. It's a little off. I've been paraphrasing it. In your hearts, revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. But do this with gentleness and respect. Yeah. So it's just 15. It keeps going. And there's more good stuff there in the chapter. But that was the part we kind of focused on as sort of a framework for how to bring Jesus into conversations without being...
condescending or superior,
right?
You know, no one. That doesn't seem Jesus-like at all, and it also doesn't seem like something I'd want to hear more about.
Right?
If someone was sharing like that with me, but it raises a question: what does hope look like?
Right. Always be ready to give an answer for the hope that you have, which suggests to me that he's assuming that that's the piece that will be evident in your life, is that you are living with hope. And what does that look like? You know, in this day and age when people are very cynical, when there's a lot going on, we have our political situation, we have all kinds of things happening with economy and all kinds of things, there's wars going on in the world. There's all kinds of disagreements about all kinds of things. What does it look like to live with hope?
Versus just put on a happy face.
Right.
Right? Or thinking positively. There's
Right.
something different about what hope looks like.
Mm-hmm.
And I from my own experience, I guess I'll just share from my own experiences, people that I am drawn to and want to spend more time with are hopeful.
Yeah.
Like, they see, and they're usually sharing why.
Right.
They have experiences where God's faithfulness continues to show up over and over and over. Maybe not in the way that they expected. Maybe not a way that they were hoping for, but they recognize God in the midst of whatever was hard or whatever was great. And they tie that back. And those are the kinds of people I'd like to spend more time with.
Right.
And it's not so much them preaching, it's just sharing their story of how, whatever the situation is, where they saw God in it, and how he's continuing to write the story.
Yeah.
So
you're wise to mention before it's not just putting on the happy face, because I think we do have that tendency, we have a culture, West Michigan nice or whatever.
Right.
We do have and also American culture has a tendency towards, find a silver lining in every cloud. And that's not exactly what we're talking about.
Correct.
This doesn't mean if something devastating happens to you, you have to look for like the bright side.
Right.
Right. But it does mean clinging to Jesus in a way, knowing that, being sure of who God is, being sure of who you are, being sure of the things that you can trust about God. And there's like a hopeful way that you can navigate even through the hardest things. That doesn't mean you have to put a smile on your face in every single situation.
Right.
But that you can actually live in a hopeful way that, might knock you down otherwise if you didn't have God.
Well, and even permission to feel that and express that when things are hard.
Yeah.
Instead of, I think the shiny, happy people or the plastic mask that some people want to put on because, I don't have permission to share how I'm really feeling, but this is really hard, or I'm really sad, or I'm really anxious about something, especially that verse that says, never be anxious. And it's like, but I am. And being able to talk about that with someone. But again, your roots are, I can trust God in this.
Right.
I wonder how God's going to show up in this or what I'm going to learn about God or myself or others through this.
Right. And sometimes I think we rush to, God's going to make something good out of this, before, like maybe too fast. I've seen people kind of rush to that. Like, well, I don't know why this happened, but I know God will bring something good out of it. And it's like, well, or maybe the truth is that God is just present with you in this.
Yeah.
And like, this was awful and it shouldn't have happened.
Correct.
And God is with you in it. I think we kind of rush. We do have this inclination to rush to the good part.
Instant gratification, Mandy?
Yes.
That's a whole nother podcast.
Yeah. And so to sit with God, like even in your sorrow or pain or disappointment, there is still a hopeful way to do that. And it doesn't necessarily mean putting a bow on it.
Right.
So, so that's interesting to think about as we go through this life. This doesn't necessarily mean you have to feel, I don't want people to feel like a layer of burden added to them by this message that you have to, put a grin and bear it. And, because you're worrying about how people will see you.
Right.
That isn't what we're trying to say at all. So I'm hoping that you hear the difference in that. I'm also struck as we think about 1 Peter 3. So you and I grew up in the same era, and I don't know if you remember, but there used to be a show. I was on one of the Christian networks where Kirk Cameron would go around and do street evangelism.
I do not remember this show. I remember
I
Kirk Cameron, but it was on Growing Pains, my friend.
This is long after Growing Pains. But he would kind of ambush people on the street. Like you'd go down to like Santa Monica Pier or something and just like, start asking them like, and I really would describe it as ambush evangelism. And I think sometimes that's how we think about what evangelism is like. And he would kind of lead them through this whole thing. And it was sort of just to get them to admit that they're a sinner. And I would say that 1 Peter 3, these verses really kind of push back against that approach.
Yeah. Gentleness and respect does not sound like ambush.
Right. And it implies that they're going to ask you.
Right.
So, which is interesting because it doesn't say like, hey, always be telling people about the hope that you have. It's be ready to give an answer.
Yeah, be ready to give an answer. It makes me think of, and I was attending Heritage Hill yesterday and heard, and actually heard this story firsthand from someone from that campus that was shared yesterday, through this relationship with a family of 10 people that has moved here from Iraq. And this individual from Cornerstone has been walking with this family and getting to know them and know their story, and really just becoming friends with and imagining coming to this country, maybe not knowing the language, not knowing how anything works.
The weather,
what to wear, how the bus works, how you get from point A to point B, like all the things. And the woman's name is Patty Riva from Cornerstone, and she shared her story that her whole family has now gotten to know this Iraqi family, and her son is most struck by this whole relationship because he had said, "Mom, I can't imagine coming here and not knowing anybody and not knowing how to get around. And wouldn't Christ want to embrace this family who's following a different faith, right? They are Muslim. And yet there's this beautiful friendship that has blossomed. And Patty herself has said, I have experienced and witnessed firsthand racism in a way that I didn't want to believe existed anymore. And so I just think that all that to say is that this family may have questions about Patty and why she would embrace them and welcome them. And she's been able to talk about her faith with this family. She shared that she goes to church. She shared about Easter. And I think that they've shared their faith, and she's acting curious and finding out what they believe, and maybe there's some common ground there.
Yeah. Well, that's a beautiful, I think, living out of this verse, because I think Peter's implying that there's going to be a relationship there, and that almost kind of saying that if you live like Christ, people are going to be curious about that. And so I think that's where we can sort of diffuse our own anxiety about memorizing the Roman road, or having to have point by point a way to lead to bring someone to Christ by proving that God exists, and really diffuse some of that anxiety and just say, if I live this out in my personal relationships, and seek out relationships with people that are different than me, because that is a crucial piece too. If all of our friends go to our church, we are unable to live this out.
Correct.
And that's something I'm convicted by, as it is hard to kind of emerge from a Christian bubble once you're in it.
Yeah. Well, especially working where you do and worshiping where you do. So I think it's about living this out in a way that, and Peter's kind of saying, like, this will happen. Yeah. So be ready. Yeah.
Be ready to give an answer.
People are going to recognize hope in other hopeless situations, right?
Yeah.
If they're used to hopelessness, hope is going to be evident.
Right.
There's something people will be drawn to hope.
Right. And then the last part of the verse, or the place we chopped it, which is, and do so with gentleness and respect, which is so interesting because, so that means 2,000 years ago almost, that was something that they also struggled with.
Yeah. Right.
To not be, like you said, condescending.
Well, weren't the Pharisees? I mean, they were condescending.
So how to do this in such a way that is winsome and natural and just genuine, sincere, heartfelt, then that, you have no control over what somebody's going to do with that story once you've shared it. But the implication is that like that's a seed that God can use, and you don't know that part's out of your hands.
Right. And you don't know what God's already doing.
Right.
And how this piece, you sharing, you living this out authentically, how that might add to the story, or quite frankly, detract from the story. If the gentleness and respect isn't there,
is lacking,
could it be the opposite?
Right. Could you actually do damage? Yeah. I think of it sometimes as, our challenge living in the United States, with so much Christian culture, so much Christian history, is that I think of people being sort of inoculated to the gospel. Like if they've had a terrible church experience, or some kind of, maybe they had a family member who said they were a Christian who treated them terribly, they sort of think they know what it's about, and they sort of don't want anything to do with it.
Right.
And so we have that challenge in the U.S. to kind of like overcome by showing, our proof that this works is in our lives.
Right.
And so that's where our focus should be, is on living this out, making this manifest in our lives in a way that people are like, oh, there's no other way to explain that except God.
Right. Yes.
Yeah. So it's very challenging. At the same time, like I think, like you said, we don't know what God is already doing in people's lives, and we believe that God is constantly pursuing all people and speaking to all people. I once heard of it to think of it as drops in a bucket. So if you think of somebody's whole life as a bucket, and over time, drop by drop, that bucket fills up until at some point that person is like comes to a point of belief. And so we're just drops in the bucket. We may never see that bucket fill up.
Right.
Maybe we do.
Right.
But that part is up to God.
Yeah, for sure.
And that relieves some of our anxiety.
I think the other thing that struck me about yesterday's message, Mandy, was, sometimes we don't think we have a story to share.
Yeah.
And so I was sitting next to my 14-year-old son who was raised in a Christian home, and I'm just like, he has a story too. So no story is better or worse than anyone else's when God is at work.
Yeah.
Right? Because God gets the glory for that.
Right.
No matter what the story is, but every person's story is worth sharing. And if you have a relationship with someone, you sharing your story, is your responsibility. I think that was what one of the points from yesterday was, I'm not going to remember it exactly right, but something comes great responsibility. With great knowledge comes, or with knowledge comes great responsibility. And so, even I have people in my life that sometimes we talk more about, I don't know, I was thinking, I could talk differently. Like I can share a story and share all of the pieces of the story instead of just selectively sharing with certain people.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And it, again, I do think you will be asked if they see hope in you.
Right.
So I'm not saying that. I'm certainly not saying it's a project or people are projects to go and come up with some plan.
Right.
That is
we don't want to be sneaky or have an agenda. As you're forming relationships with people, you just love them for who they are.
Yeah.
Love them in the way that God would love them, and just trust the process.
Yeah.
And that can help us not feel like it's all on our shoulders, which I think sometimes as Americans we're like, we gotta do it.
Right. And yes, now. They have to do it right now.
Now that doesn't mean just shrug it off and it's all God's work.
No.
God has invited us in to be a part of that. We get to be a part of that and form relationships with people in the community. And it's the story you shared, of Patty, of stepping in where help is needed and just loving them for who they are. And who knows what will come out of that? We don't know.
Right, we don't know.
But she's simply loving them where they're at.
What we do know is that both families involved have a richness to their life and have learned things. And so,
and they're blessed. That's
it's a beautiful blessing both ways. It's not one receiver, one giver. It is mutually beneficial, mutually enriching, mutually lovely.
Right. That's a great place to end. Thanks so much for joining us, Tracy. This is, like I said, the end of this series. Next week, we have a standalone message for Labor Day, so there'll be no BTW, but we will pick back up with a new series, which is called Patterns. And I'll just leave that to your imagination for what that could be about. So we will see you in a couple of weeks. Thanks a lot.